Hello, everyone. I'm Kari Vogelgesang, your host of the Educator Wellness Podcast, here to share and promote my life's work and passion, all things wellness. But not just any wellness, we're here to discuss wellness specifically as it pertains to educators. I am a former elementary school teacher, and I am passionate about helping educators see wellness in a very different way. This podcast is dedicated to educators across the globe, creating a space for us to come together in an authentic and therapeutic way, sharing our stories, our hopes, our joys, our fears, our sorrows, and hopefully creating some space to share some laughter with one another as well. In our journey to learn how to support one another to prioritize wellness and enhance our overall well being. Please join me as we talk with nationally recognized experts to guide us on a transformative journey of self-discovery, helping us to embrace and weave all dimensions of wellness into the fabric of both our personal and professional lives. Also, please note that the opinions and perspectives that are shared on this podcast do not necessarily represent those of the Scanlon Center for School Mental Health or the University of Iowa. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Scanlon Center for School Mental Health Educator Wellness Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Kari Vogelgesang, and we are so happy to have you joining us today. We have some very special guests. Our conversation today is going to be focused on all things global education. We are talking about global education and why this is such an important topic right now in the world of education and our world period, and how you can increase global education opportunities for your students and even for yourself as an educator. But let's go ahead and start with introducing you to our very special guests. Our first one is a dear, dear friend of mine and colleague, Dr. William Coghill Behrends. He is a clinical associate professor of multilingual education at the University of Iowa. He also co-directs the Baker Teacher Leader Center with me, where he leads a focus on global education initiatives. Will was a classroom world language teacher, starting his career abroad in Germany and teaching more recently in Iowa City before moving to the University of Iowa. In his current position, he supports the comprehensive internationalization of the College of Education, including the development of educational opportunities abroad for pre-service teachers to grow in their own global education competency. He also works with in-service teachers on this as well. In this work, he has led numerous students on study abroad trips to South Africa, Eswatini, Germany, Japan, Norway, France, and Costa Rica. He is always traveling somewhere super exciting. He has an amazing job and he does amazing work. So welcome, Dr. Coghill Behrends, to the conversation. Our next special guest, also a dear colleague and friend of mine, Amy Andreassen. She is a rural Iowa public school principal, a social emotional learning facilitator, certified yoga instructor, public education advocate, and self-proclaimed reader of all the books. I understand that. And yes, she is definitely. With a passion for empowering individuals and creating supportive communities, Amy has dedicated her 30-year educational career to promoting social emotional learning and enhancing the well-being of students, teachers, and families. Amy is also on TikTok. Amy's TikTok account at @average_principal has amassed a following of thousands who appreciate her insights and engaging personality. This is very true. Amy was named an Iowa Global Educator Wellness Ambassador through the University of Iowa's Baker Teacher Leader Center Global Educator Wellness Ambassador Program cohort number 1. And her multifaceted interests and passions make her a dynamic and inspiring individual who is committed to making a positive impact on the world around her. And finally, but of course, definitely not least, Monique Cottman is a 17-year veteran of public schools and currently serves as a curriculum specialist for the Iowa City Community School District. She works towards equity and justice through her work as a curriculum specialist. She is an adjunct professor at the University of Iowa and an education consultant. Monique co-founded Black Lives Matter at School, Iowa in 2020 and provides Black history education to Black youth across the state of Iowa. As a proud union member, Monique serves on several state and national committees, including the ISEA Multicultural Committee and the NEA Leaders for Just Schools Facilitation Team. Monique was also named an Iowa Global Educator Wellness Ambassador through the University of Iowa's Baker Teacher Leader Center Global Educator Wellness Ambassador Program, and she was also part of our first cohort of this program, where we took 9 different Iowa educators through a year-long curriculum focusing on outdoor education, global education, and wellness in schools and in your community. And we ended that experience with a trip to Norway. You're going to learn all about that experience and so much more. This episode really focuses on the key components of global education. We talk through the benefits of participating in global education opportunities, not just for students, but for educators as well. So please join me and our special guests as we learn more about all things global education and how it impacts the well-being of an individual, but also of an entire community. Welcome, everyone, to the Scanlon Center for School Mental Health podcast. I'm so excited to have all of my friends and colleagues joining me today. I'm going to introduce them here in a little bit. But before we get started with that, I just want to let everyone know that today's topic is going to be global education, and we're going to focus on the benefits of providing global education experiences for both students and educators in a K through 12 environments. And we are going to have our experts on the podcast today share both personal experiences and also share some academic perspectives on the benefits of providing these types of experiences for teachers and students. So welcome, everyone. Thank you all again for joining me today.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, it's good to be here.
Good to be here.
It's good to get the band back together.
Yeah, it is. We were recently all together in Norway in June, and now a month later we're home and maybe still kind of unpacking some of those experiences that we had together in Norway.
And literally unpacking, but
yeah. Have we all unpacked our bags yet?
Put it away.
We're working on it.
I'm ready for another trip, though.
Yeah, for sure. One of the things that I have I like to do, and this is something that I started to do with Will on one of our trips, was go grocery shopping right before we come back to the United States. So I still have like a bag full of stuff that we bought at a grocery store there that we're trying to get through. But
And it's not the typical touristy stuff like chocolate or candies. It's oatmeal and coffee and baking supplies.
Baking supplies because their flour is so much better than ours, number one. But also, for those of you who have not had Norwegian porridge, you're missing out. This is something you have to stockpile every time you go to Norway or go to Finland. They have it, and it is amazing. So we can maybe talk a little bit more about porridge later.
It's a different podcast.
Please have us back for the porridge podcast.
Yeah,
we are.
I want to do the tasting. Yeah.
You can. Well, I should have you all over, and we can do it. It's actually it's not tricky, but like you'd be shocked at how much milk you have to use to make it. It's like you have to however much porridge you use, you have to like multiply that by like 5 times the liquid. Yeah, it's really. Anyway, okay, here we go. So that's our first lesson on this podcast when global ed is porridge.
Always try the porridge.
Always eat porridge. Okay, but first of all, when we say global ed, like what? And Will, maybe you can start by answering this question because you really have studied this and have written papers about this and presented information at all kinds of conferences. When we say global education, what does that actually mean?
Okay, so great question, but I'm going to take a step backwards first. Since before we talk about global education, I want to talk about the phenomenon that we hear a lot about these days, which is globalization in general. Okay. When we talk about globalization, what we're really talking about is sort of the integrated economic structures that exist, the transnational flow of assets, of goods, of ideas, of networked ideas. We're talking about the sort of intense and interconnected geopolitical and geosocial and sociocultural lines that intersect across the globe. The way in which the digitized world, especially in the last 2 decades, I think has made these connections more apparent and more available and more accessible to everybody. And so before we talk about globalization, I think we need to talk about sort of the nature of the world right now, which is that we're living in a highly interdependent, interconnected, international world. Global education then is a response to prepare people to live in that world.
Hmm.
And newer ways of thinking about global education specifically are separating themselves from just international education, which is this idea that we're learning about other people around the world, to really sort of begin to interrupt some of these systems that are unsustainable and inappropriate, frankly, right? And that are creating and recreating these systems of injustice, of wealth inequity, and this kind of thing. So, global education, and more specifically, critical global education, looks at ways we can develop competencies among teachers and students to prepare them to live in this world, to recognize their own positionality, the power structure within which they exist. To look at and recognize injustice, right? So, this notion of social justice across the curriculum, and really providing students with a toolkit and a skill set to take action, right? So we're talking about recognizing and developing multiple perspectives, understanding their positionality, understanding power structures, and then being motivated to work toward change in some capacity. And so there are lots and lots of frameworks for thinking about global education. The Longview Foundation, the Asia Society, which ironically is headquartered in New York City, the OECD, the US Department of Education. There are so many frameworks for thinking about what is the global skill set necessary for people to be successful. And then in global education, in critical global education, we like to take that a step further and say, this isn't just about personal success. This is about our success as a planet. This is about our success as humanity. This is about our success as sort of a collective people, right?
Mhm.
How do we uplift and value? How do we find opportunities for joy for everybody? How do we create equitable living situations, right? How do we eliminate things like food scarcity, water insecurity, food insecurity, right? So this is really, and global education seeks to provide students opportunities and pathways to understand and to interrupt those sorts of things.
Yeah. So, would you even say, would it be accurate to say that global education opportunities is another way to help create systems of equity and of social justice within our educational system as a whole?
Yeah, and so, and this is where I think, Carrie, I know we're getting to this, but this is the connection between wellness, frankly, and global
Mhm.
education, right? Is this idea that when we create a different habitable space, right? When we create different ways of being and living, right? Ways that honor the earth, ways that honor our environment, ways that honor our
Mm.
histories and our identities, and ways of living that sort of, again, elevate all of us, not just some of us, right? Then we create opportunities and pathways for more people to experience success, more people to find joy, and more people to live in ways that promote wellness and healthy ways of being.
Yeah, I love that. And I love that you made that like direct connection. I was gonna try to get us there in a more crafty way, Will, but
Sorry,
that's great actually that you just like explicitly said it and we have it out there and we can see that connection right away. So Monique, let's go ahead and start with you in terms of your experiences. I know both of you, Amy and Monique, do some really great work in your own school districts in the state of Iowa around equity and justice and inclusion. And I know that you also have both done global education experiences to enhance this work. Monique, is there a specific experience that you can share with us or even a personal story that has influenced your professional work in a way that you think has maybe changed the way you do your work or maybe has changed the way your colleagues thinks about equity, wellness, justice within education?
Wow, that's a big question. Is there one thing that has impacted?
Or maybe just like an experience, a global experience that you've brought back to your work that has made a really big impact.
Sure. The first thing that came to mind, so I'll kind of take it two different ways. The first thing that came to mind was just going through teacher prep in my undergrad program at Penn State, just having teachers from around the world, right? That was my first time having a teacher who was not born in the United States, who was not educated in the United States, and had different sensibilities that I couldn't quite name as a student, number one. Number two, I'm just trying to get a grade in that class. But there was some difference there that I could start to pick up on as I'm comparing professor to professor, or even hearing comments from students about their perceptions of having a teacher who, for example, speaks with an accent or doesn't value the same level of citing sources that we were taught in American schools compared to a European school or an Asian school. And so I thought that that was interesting because it was my first time experiencing education as a global event and not necessarily the American lens that I had only known growing up here in America. But shifting now, some odd years in the future, to our recent trip to Norway and thinking about even there in the Norwegian culture, there were several Norwegians who had other backgrounds, who came from other countries, and being in Oslo, where it was such a diverse city, where there were multiple countries represented, even in just the coffee shop that we would go to on the corner, and how that changes the discourse within the city. And it changes even how people are able to move around on public transportation, that there's this idea of communication that is available when we are aware of what's around us. And so for me, the beauty of global education, connecting to what Will is talking about with social justice, is that it gives us a way to be together, and it gives us a way to communicate outside of the superficial terms of I'm a tourist, or outside of capitalist terms of I am only here for your goods and services, but we're truly balanced on a way of being human that it's hard to explore if you're not given those types of experiences.
Yeah. Like really living in that experience instead of just reading about it or talking about it with somebody at, a table. I mean, that sometimes is all we have access to, right? But it does, when you start to actually live in it, in those different communities and in those different experiences, it does change perspectives, it changes feelings, it changes intention. I think that's what you're trying to get, what you're talking about too. At least it has for me, in my experiences too.
And I'm glad that we were asked when we were in Norway to step outside of the official structures, right? To not just be in school, to not just be in lecture, but to talk to people, because even that format of education being I'm coming in as a student, sitting at your feet in your school and learning from you, that's a way that we can learn. But there's also the let's go get a meal together, or let's walk around a sculpture garden, or let me hear your perspective of how you're looking at this sculpture, the way I'm looking at the sculpture. And being able to communicate in an art museum is another powerful way to be a student or to be a teacher outside of the traditional confines.
Yeah. So I'm going to take a step back just a little bit, because Monique was talking about a specific experience that we all just shared together in Oslo, Norway. And we did some training leading up to going into Oslo. And so, Amy, I'm wondering if maybe now you could share with our audience what that experience was. So it was this Global Educator Ambassador program that Will and I created here at the University of Iowa through the Baker Teacher Leader Center. And Amy, there's 3 different pillars of this program. And I'm wondering if you can just unpack this program, what it meant to you, how those pillars connected, and what that experience was like for you.
Well, that's a great question because, Carrie, I think that you and Will would be the first to say that we kind of defined the program together as we traveled through the year of studies with it. And so the three pillars would be global education, it would be teacher wellness, and then the third component is the outdoor education component. And so at first glance, those three things may not seem like they are interconnected, at least not easily interconnected. But I think that all of us through the program found out that they overlap in so many ways. And one of the things that we have been charged to do as the first cohort that has gone through this is creating some type of project to bring back to our districts. And even that, I have found that has so many overlaps with the global education. And I'm going to refer to something that you shared with us, which were the UN sustainability goals. And part of those goals are creating a world for the future, and that is the clean water, and that is respecting the land. And that fits so well into the global education perspective, outdoor education. And then it also fits into teacher wellness because we know research has told us that. Spending time outdoors and in the environment will help us as teachers, as humans, experiencing those outdoor adventures. It helps with stress reduction. It helps with our physical and our mental, our emotional, our spiritual sides. And so there's a lot of research about that. And so those fit in so nicely with the UN sustainability goals. And so all of this was new information for me. And I've had such a great time just really delving into how those interconnect with each other. And in working on the project, really trying to decide how we can make that something that is system wide in our districts.
Yeah. Yeah, baking it into a system, right, is the goal.
Right.
We know that we're in this space with education right now that teachers aren't entering the field.
Right.
Teachers who are in the field are leaving. Students aren't showing up. We have a huge crisis when it comes to attendance and chronic absenteeism or in school avoidance. And the interesting piece about a lot of the stuff that, all three of you have kind of touched on and talked about is that we actually know what's healthy for us. Like we have an overwhelming amount of data that supports benefits of learning about globalization and global education opportunities. I just recorded a podcast yesterday with two. Well, Jay was one of them, and then a professor at St. Ambrose about the benefits of outdoor education. We know about the benefits of focusing on and tending to our 8 dimensions of wellness, which you just alluded to, Amy, and what you were just sharing with us. But then how do we change our age-old systems, right, to incorporate these things that we know are absolutely critical? And I think that's kind of the big question. I sure don't have the $1 million, right, or $1 billion. With inflation, I think it's billion now. Answer to all of this. But do any of you three have some ideas for how, and you were just starting kind of down this path, Amy, a little bit, some ideas for school districts? You have this system. We actually know what's really healthy for educators and students. What are some suggestions we can give to administrators and to educators, maybe even in their own classroom and their communities, to start to incorporate some, global education, outdoor education, 8 dimensions of wellness in their daily practices, not only for themselves, but then transcend that, into information and knowledge with their students?
Well, if you don't mind me jumping back into this, I just wanted to share the way that I'm starting, and maybe would be helpful to others. And that is to find connections to your local community. So it is much easier to focus on things starting at our local community than trying to get everyone's attention to something that may be so far out there that we really only have heard or maybe even haven't heard of it, and trying to make that a centralized problem or activity. And so one thing that we know here in our school. I'm in a very rural area. A lot of our families live on family farms. I live on a century farm. We are surrounded by bean fields, and we are surrounded by cornfields. And 12 miles north from my house on the same road is a giant corporation. Didn't start out giant, but it's called Kinsey's. And Kinsey's is a manufacturer of mostly carts, grain carts. They also do planters and some other agricultural items. And we have a lot of families that have connections to Kinsey's. Either the parents work there, they buy things from Kinsey's, and Kinsey's is a global phenomenon. And if you even go to their website, right away have a pull down menu to let them know what your region is, because they work with many European countries. They work with Asia, they work with Russia and Ukraine. So right away you pull down and get to the website, and we're talking about a company that's in the 12 miles away from our little school, and they have such a global reach at this point. And so how does that tie in of their need for students who understand globalization and understand kind of global policies? They keep open minds. They have cultural competency. How does that connect with our school district? And then we can also talk about things. The latest polls from the ISU Extension Office, the latest farm survey, shows that over 81% of farmers believe that we are in a climate culture or climate concerns, that we're in a crisis. And 81% have shown that it is something that they're very concerned about. Now, only 18% reported that they believe that the human side really has much to do with it. But if we can focus on that 81% who feel like stewards of the environment, so how can we, in our little community, help? And that's a UN sustainability goal as well, is protecting the land. And so all of that tying together, that my students will know, well, I know Kinsey's. My dad's a farmer. I am outside all of the time and enjoying nature. So how can we pull all of that together and take action in our own little area and then build from there?
That's a wonderful example of how you're really thinking critically about what's happening in your own community and making those connections for students. Because it's true, oftentimes if we don't make those like really personal connections at the beginning, it's hard for people to conceptualize it. It's hard for people, to anchor something, their own experiences to it and get moving. Monique, what about you? How have you been kind of inspired by or thinking about how you can disrupt some systems that are maybe not so healthy and start to create some new like microsystems maybe?
Yeah, you said my favorite word. I love disrupting systems.
Good. So
but I did want to connect to Kari, what you were saying about wellness and how can we bring that into the schools. For me, the overarching theme is communication. That, right, we have students not showing up, we have parents who are disgruntled, we have staff who are dissatisfied, but each group is talking to each other and or to themselves and not necessarily to each other. And so thinking about ways that we can, as a school system, embed more practices where people intentionally come together so that we can have those real conversations about what's going on and not necessarily trying to have a top-down approach, I think is going to shift us to that path of wellness. Because the way we've tried to fix it in the past just isn't working because we don't have all the voices at the table, and we're not honest about the power dynamics that exist and some of the barriers that exist to keep that real conversation from happening. And then connecting to what we were saying about global education and thinking about communication, right? We can't continue to be a monolingual society if we're thinking about being in a global world, and even thinking about the power dynamics that exist when we tell elementary students that you have to learn English, that English is the only language that's taught in elementary school, well, then English holds a lot of power. And what if we shifted it to say that every student going to elementary school is going to learn a language? And if you have languages that are readily available in your community, how are you tapping into those resources so that we truly become a community and we can all communicate with each other? Some of the most heartbreaking stories that I hear from parents are that when their children are learning English, they then lose access to their grandparents and their cousins and their extended family because they can no longer communicate with the people who love them the most. And so what does it mean for us to live in a school district that pushes that agenda, that preaches that message, right? And so I think communication and all of us learning our languages, and that can be like the physical language, it can be the love language, it can be where we are in community, right? If we can just come together, we can solve a lot of these challenges. I'm also thinking about when you were talking, Kari, about students not showing up. I recently went to a 3-on-3 basketball tournament and the park was packed, right? All the students were there. So it's not that we don't know where the students are, right? We know where they are. Is the school there? Does the school see value in going to the 3-on-3 tournament? And does the kid at the 3-on-3 tournament see value in going to school? And let's have conversation about why we'll show up in one space and not another, or why I feel like it's my job to show up in one space as a teacher, but not my job to show up in another space as an educator. And so there's just all of this miscommunication that's happening that's keeping us from being able to name what it is that we need for wellness in our spaces. And I think that's an important task. We have to name it before we can push towards it. And so my goal as I work with lots of different organizations or entities is to really focus on that communication piece and really be clear about what our message is and how it's attached to us, and think about how our message is being perceived by others, how we want it to be received by others. These are all things that deep down we really want. We really want connection with each other. And I think just those small tweaks and how we're interacting with each other are really going to be helpful.
Yeah, Monique, that was really beautifully said, like that communication piece, and even just centering and talking about how we center English and why do we not just value learning, all of us learning languages. And Will, that's a great pivot to you because this is your area of expertise. This is your department as a multilingual educator. Can you kind of extend or elaborate a little bit more on that?
Yeah.
And the complexity of that maybe in our current systems, and maybe some thoughts on how to change that perspective?
Yeah, for sure. So lots of really great things happening here in this conversation, right? So I want to jump back to Amy's, acknowledging how critical it is for us to start local as we think about educating students for global citizenship and getting them to see sort of that bigger picture. If we're not anchoring that to something tangible in their community that has meaning and holds meaning for them, it's really complicated and sometimes impossible for us to then take that next step, right? I think of one of my colleagues at Harvard University's Project Zero, their work in sort of the 3 whys, right? So asking students to think about at a very simplistic level, why is this important to me? Why is this important to the community? And why is this important to the world? That's one simple strategy, right, for getting students to start thinking about making those broader and bigger connections. To Monique's point about this we call this subtractive bilingualism, right? The idea that as students gain knowledge in a particular area in English, right, because of the linguistic capital of English right now, that they may lose skill and ability to continue speaking in maybe a first language or a home language. And we really want teachers now to honor and acknowledge and celebrate, right, all of the linguistic assets that students bring to the classroom, right? Whether they're English, whether they're Spanish, whether they're, French, right, et cetera. Like there are so many students coming into our communities whose first language isn't English. And when we pursue these English only policies and English only environments, we end up actually doing damage to students. And so it's really important for us to again find ways to honor and really celebrate those languages and those skills that students are bringing. I mean, it really is like bilingualism is a really complex cognitive process, right? And we have little kids who are bilinguals, right? And that is genius, right? But sometimes the message that these little ones get is like, there's something wrong with them, or we don't speak that language here, right? And so we have to move away from environments that don't encourage that. I think that, frankly, we're in a really complex space right now because, on the one hand, we know when we talk about what we let off with this podcast, right? What is globalization, right? We're living in a super interconnected world. Iowa does something like $2 billion of international business, every year, the state of Iowa. And so, right, we have this incredible connection to the world that everybody in all like levels of government, all legislatively involved folks would acknowledge, right, our connections to the global. Yet we're living in a time when it seems like some of these strategies, some of these ideas, some of these standards that we've held in education as sort of, natural, important, and critical to the success of the kid, to the kid's wellness, are beginning to be legislated in ways, that are really confounding for teachers, right? And so I give one example. We were asked to define global citizenship this year by the state legislature because they felt like it was a dangerous term. I'm not sure what's dangerous about global citizenship, right? When you look at every state document, in fact, the National Export Strategy, right, which was just released by our Secretary of Commerce, National Export Strategy now lists international education as one of our key commodities, one of our key exports, right, because of the value of a U.S. education and the value of education sort of in the world. Yet, people are beginning to control this in ways that are shifting the narrative about education, what education is, education for the good, right? We think about sort of the critical nature and notion of education as something critical for democracy to happen, right? People need to be able to be critical and think critically about the various issues that we're facing, right? And when we start removing some of that criticality, when we start removing some of those options for teachers to acknowledge their own environment and enact what we have trained them to do. Teachers are so skilled and they do such a good job in their own classrooms. Yet at the same time, we're seeing sort of a chokehold on teachers about what they can teach and how they can teach it. And that is really concerning to me because I think it's really changing what we do as teachers. And not only that, but it's scaring a lot of teachers. A lot of teachers now really are wondering, can I teach that? Can I talk about that? What? And this is wrong. This is wrong for education. It's wrong for our kids. And that's where I think all of us who are really committed to this notion of critical global education, or even Dr. Kefferlin Brown from UT Austin, who says, like, we have to really critically examine whose sociocultural knowledge we're imparting in the classroom, right? Like, who gets to decide what's important? And right now, I think we see efforts across the nation to redefine that, again, sort of reverting back to old narratives that have actually been, that are oppressive. And that's what we have to really fight against, I think, as teachers. And I know that administrators like Amy and Monique are doing everything that they can, but it's an uphill battle right now in education, and it feels really exhausting. And I think we feel that threat as teachers. And that's concerning to me. So
Yeah.
What the answer is, I mean, I think the answer is advocacy. I think we continue talking to our friends and neighbors about the things that matter to us. I think we let them know what it means when people, our neighbors, pursue some of these policies. I was even doing a workshop for teachers early this summer, and one of the administrators was asking a teacher to make sure that they represent multiple perspectives of, and I'm not going to name the issue, but let's just say it was an issue that we feel like we have some settled history on. And the teacher simply started asking the administrator questions like, so you want me to teach fascism? Like, you want me to teach about this history of genocide and acknowledging, right, those that enacted the genocide and humanizing those people while dehumanizing the people who actually died? Like, and when the administrator heard those questions, they immediately stopped in their tracks and they were like, yeah, you're right. That doesn't make sense. Carry on. You
Well,
know?
I wanted to jump in here you just really hit a big topic, and that is for all of us to understand our own biases and to confront those biases. And I actually learned something from Monique. And Monique, I don't remember if you remember this conversation, but it was one of our first days in Norway, and I had been to the museum there right on the fjord, and you had also been to the museum, and we were talking a little bit, and as we walked through the streets of Oslo, and I had seen there was a thing about what some type of a display about what made Norway such a shipping empire and made it such a rich country, a power in the Northern European area. I don't remember the exact. And you said it was interesting to you, the story was being told because Norway, the reason it became such a powerhouse in Northern Europe was off of the slave trade, and having, it wasn't even mentioned in the display. And so you kind of challenged and said, whose story are they telling? What perspective are they telling?
Mm-hmm.
I stood in front of that same thing and thought and looked at the maps and where the gold was going, and not once did I think to myself what cultures were being demonized, and how Norway gained that prominence in Northern Europe. And by you simply saying, beware of the one story, the one narrative, I had a bias right there that was I had to acknowledge at the time. So it's really important that even though we're talking about multilingual education, global in a homogeneous area like I live in a homogeneous district, where 99% of our students are white, and we have to approach globalization as really understanding and appreciating other cultures, and being able to interact with other cultures, respect other cultures, keep an open mind, flexibility, understanding a perspective other than our own. All of that has to fit into our global education, especially in a homogeneous. And so that simple conversation with Monique just really opened my eyes to how much more I need to learn and how much more I need to challenge myself on my own biases.
Yeah.
We sometimes say,
that conversation?
yeah,
I do remember that conversation.
I do
And I
too.
appreciate you saying it, Amy, because it goes back to what I was saying about communication, right? We were given space and we felt comfortable talking to each other on a very real level that does not exist in all public school spaces, right? In fact, there are pressures in a public school and a professional space to not have that conversation, to not push and to not name biases and to not have conversations that could be uncomfortable or make people feel any sort of negative sort of feelings about history. And so I appreciated that we were given that opportunity to connect with each other, to learn and grow from each other while we're on this amazing experience. And just that's helping me to solidify why we need more experiences like that in our schools, not just for our students, but for the adults who live there, right? We need to be able to have conversation with each other. And how much more willing are folks going to be to come into the conversation when they know that they can be their authentic selves and to say something that may be counter to the majority opinion, but to still feel supported, to still feel loved, to still feel like they're a part of that community. And that's one of those shifts that we're just going to have to make in our schools.
Yeah, and
Monique.
it's Monique, you just said something that I think that we're all trying really hard to work on with teachers and with parents and students, which is this idea that nobody should ever feel uncomfortable. And that if you do feel uncomfortable, then there might be something wrong with you, or somebody did something wrong in that space, because nobody should ever have to be sitting with uncomfortable feelings. And this is a serious issue that's happening, not just in school systems, but in public spaces and even in families, really across the globe, which is, it's just absolutely mind-blowing to me that we would think that we would live our lives and never have to feel uncomfortable. Uncomfortable feelings make us grow.
Yeah.
They're good. They shouldn't be demonized, and we shouldn't be creating spaces where we try to just always be protective of other people not feeling uncomfortable. You can't get better as an athlete if you're not uncomfortable a lot of the time when you're training. You can't grow as a person if you don't sit with uncomfortable feelings and you learn how to, in healthy ways, manage and address these uncomfortable feelings and uncomfortable thoughts that you have. I'm not saying that there isn't any such thing as, chronic anxiety or depression, I'm not saying that at all. But what I am saying is that sometimes we immediately go to this space of there's something wrong with me, or there's something wrong with that other person because I'm feeling uncomfortable.
Right.
That's not true. We're human. You're alive. So you should celebrate that and then learn from it. And we have to just, and so I think that's a beautiful example of how a global education experience between two people who were living through that experience and traveling through some challenges that we all had in that global ed experience worked together to point some things out and address some things, and we grew from it.
Well, the other piece I think too, Kari, hearing you talk about the discomfort in schools is that we've always had in America populations in public school who have been uncomfortable, who have been harmed. And so for me, this new conversation about discomfort is really coming from a place of not understanding our full history as Americans.
That's a good point.
Thinking about even in the state of Iowa that we had Indian boarding schools here, or thinking about the firing of Black educators who weren't able to teach after Brown versus Board of Education, right? Mm-hmm. There's all this wealth of knowledge of how to push past the discomfort of white supremacy culture, to push past the discomfort of sexism and all of the other oppressions that have existed in public school. And that history, that knowledge is here, but it's not centered in our colleges of education, but it is in our communities. And so the more that we can connect with those histories and connect with those stories of what was it like for someone to have to go through that? That's a horrible experience, right? To have to go through a boarding school. But that story is here, and that knowledge is here, and that resilience of what it means to still want to be in community, to still be able to move forward together is here. And if we limit ourselves on, but now I'm feeling uncomfortable, then we never have access to that, and we can never really move forward together.
I would just add too that schools are the place where students should have an opportunity to practice this stuff, right? I mean, this is where, and by the way, I don't know if you can hear all of the kids outside of my office, but because of the heat, UI Wild is right outside my door. At any rate, for so many decades, schools were the place where people learned how to have some conversations, not always in ways that were honest and authentic, right? But we are robbing students of an opportunity to practice this skill that they definitely need to be successful as adults in life, right? And so when we avoid these conversations, when we seek to diminish emotionality in the world around us, right, we really rob students of an opportunity to become the adults that we hope that they'll be. So,
well, we're robbing adults too.
Yeah.
I mean, what we have seen, particularly since COVID, is that the adults aren't practicing this. You know, adults aren't learning from each other. Adults aren't sitting in rooms and modeling how to have these kinds of difficult or uncomfortable conversations. And, you know, and so this is a huge problem. This is one of the reasons why Scanlon in particular really focuses on, you know, administrators and educators first, because we cannot expect administrators and educators to be teaching and modeling these things to our students and families if they're not doing them, if they don't understand it, if they don't see the value.
Kari, I wanted to, it really brought home something that happened to me through the University of Iowa many years ago. Our school participated, our teachers participated in a program through the College of Education. And the research project was that if we strengthen teachers' own knowledge of mathematical concepts, that will impact how they teach mathematics to students. And so we went to 2 summers for a week at a time at the University of Iowa, all of the teachers. And it wasn't about teaching mathematics. It was about teaching the teachers mathematics and strengthening our understanding of mathematics, making us more familiar with it, making us more at ease with some of those maybe higher level concepts. And in turn, as we became more comfortable with mathematics and our own ability, then passing that down to our students. And we are the same way with global education right now.
Yeah.
We need to, as educators, need to educate ourselves. And that's what the program's all about. It's not how to make your students be more globally aware. It is challenging the educators to become more globally aware and seeing how that impacts the systems where we spend our time. So I see a real connection with that.
That
And
was
I would
beautifully
just,
said.
yeah, it really was. And I do think, to echo Amy's point, we sometimes wonder, like, what's next and what can we do? And the thing that we can do that we know works is professional development opportunities for teachers.
Right.
And we can't take everybody to Norway, but we can try to replicate the key learnings around global education and make those connections to teacher wellness, community wellness, school wellness even, right? And we can do that through professional development. And so we need to continue to have, administrators like Amy and Monique work to create these opportunities for their teachers, because it's only through those opportunities that teachers really do get to think and to practice some of this stuff for themselves.
I really appreciate all of you coming on today and having this conversation with me. We always have good conversation when we're together. And I'm sure we'll all stay connected, particularly through your trainings that you're going to be doing in your district. Will and I are going to come observe and see some of that. So I really appreciate all of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank
Good to
you.
see you all.
Everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
I hope you all enjoyed listening to that conversation with Will, Amy, and Monique as much as I enjoyed having it with them. I know I learned a lot about global education. Whenever I'm talking about global ed with Will in particular, I am always learning so much and thinking about how important this topic is for all of us to better understand difference and to also give ourselves opportunities to experience difference and to experience thoughts and feelings and ways of doing life that are just outside of our norms and what our own typical experiences are. And I think we all know how important that is for, again, not just our students to have that experience, but for us as educators as well. If we aren't always thinking about how things can be done differently or why people think about things in different ways and feel maybe about things differently than we feel, I don't think it's going to be very easy for us to come together and reach a common ground. It's important for us to stretch ourselves and to go outside of our typical day and our typical way of experiencing life. So to see common humanity across the globe. I would love to hear more from you. I would love to hear more from you about your thoughts on this topic or on other topics that you hope we cover on this podcast. If you have ideas for us, I invite you to share your comments, your stories, your suggestions, your feelings with me at Scanlon Center for School Mental Health. You can email me at scsmh-maine@uiowa.edu. Thank you for joining me today. And until next time, I'm your host, Dr. Kari Vogelgesang, forever cheering you on.